Welcome alumni, welcome to the Honors College students and to the class for Chicago's future. It's going to take us just a moment or two for everyone to get logged in here, and then we will get underway. So give us just a couple of minutes for your colleagues to all join us. So again, welcome to the Honors College. I'm joined by Dean Ralph Keene, who will be part of today's events, and particularly the Honors College discussion afterwards. We should note as well, we have alumni. We have also the Future of Chicago lecture series and the students that are there as part of this. So give us just one moment to get us underway. I do want to make one announcement, which is that I want to talk just a moment about next week's speaker. We have with us next Monday, former Governor Pat Quinn, who will be talking about the meaning of the 2020 election and the future of Illinois. Hopefully by next Monday, the election will be more or less over, although that's not certain. We'll certainly have court cases and controversy for some time to come. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the alderman while he is still getting signed in, so that we don't waste time when he does come on. Alderman Byron Sigcho Lopez is the 25th Ward Alderman. He was elected in that progressive wave of aldermen that got elected in 2019. He is the alderman or the representative in the city council for Pilsen, for Chinatown, and for a significant section of the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is himself a graduate of UIC with a master's degree and is currently still a PhD candidate here, even while he serves as alderman in the Chicago City Council. So we'll talk about with him about the future of Chicago, particularly the role of the progressive movement in Chicago and the role of Latino politics. Latino politics has been called the third wave in Chicago politics. Latinos are the fastest growing population in Chicago, along with Asian Americans. And the alderman is a significant leader in both the progressive and the Latino movements. I will make just a couple of comments on the election while we're still waiting for the alderman's arrival, and then the moment that he gets here, we will turn the platform over to him. In terms of last night's election, there are some things we do know. We know it is the most expensive election in world history, and certainly in American history. More than $14 billion was spent on the election, split between the presidential election and the congressional election, and of course all of the local elections, but mostly on the presidential and congressional elections. So it was significant. It does look at the moment like it is likely that Biden will be elected president, but there are a number of contested states still being counted and a number of court cases to be resolved. Here in Illinois, we have somewhat more final results. We know that the graduated income tax failed. We know that the Democrats control the governorship in both houses of the state legislature. We know that the congressional delegation from Illinois is still strongly Democratic. There are 13 Democratic aldermen and only 5 Republican aldermen, and that balance looks to be unchanged. Finally, there, of course, there are 2 US senators who are both from the Democratic Party. So that's sort of what we know about the election. We also know that in Chicago, we're facing major crises, and it is that to which the alderman will be speaking as soon as we are able to get him here with you. You may want to think about the questions you want to ask, both about the election, but particularly about the direction of Chicago's future with the progressive movement and with Latino politics. And we'll be back with you with the Alderman in just one moment. Welcome, Alderman.
Hey, Professor Simpson. Sorry, I had a little issue with my the link.
Yeah, everyone may have had some difficulties. I've already introduced you to save us time. So as you know, we're interested in the future of Chicago, particularly progressive politics, Latino politics, and of course, last night's election. So we're anxious to hear what you can tell us.
Well, thank you, Professor Simpson. It's a pleasure to be with you and your class in my alma mater. So it's great to see all of you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Of course, is such an interesting time to talk politics. I think with I think the elections in mind, and as we continue to wait for the results, I do think it is important to kind of maybe reflect on what is happening locally as we see at the national sphere. At least, here locally, I think progressive politics have taken, I think, or have been getting a little bit more attention. The need for better government, more accountability in government, more scrutiny of our public officials, I think is growing. I think, perhaps some of us will wish that grows faster. And of course, that it spreads throughout the country. I think here in Chicago, we have seen the effects of corruption in our communities. We have seen the effects of bad decisions and public officials who listen to their donors, to their pockets, more than they listen to their constituents and the greater good. That focus on their fundraising capabilities more than creating policy and vote in the best interest of their constituents and the city at large. I think here, at least in the city, I think Vivek and I know Professor Simpson mentioned a little bit about Latino politics that I can speak a little bit about. What is interesting, I think, is that at least in the Latino caucus, in the city council, for instance, I think, which at least had a reputation of perhaps rubber stamp caucus, or a caucus who perhaps did not take a stance on things. We have seen a little bit more, I think, at least in some of our members, a more coordinated effort to fight for progressive politics within the Latino caucus. I think that we've seen in the 3rd Ward, in the 35th Ward, in the 1st Ward, that are part of the Latino caucus, in the 40th Ward, and the 25th Ward, I changed that, from very entrenched alderman, machine, you will say, officials, to a more progressive wave of representatives that I think, in the first year and a half have voted, in my opinion, in the best interest of the working people, of the small businesses, on the most vulnerable in our communities. I think that we have had conversations within the caucus about the importance in these times when we're in the middle of a pandemic, when we see communities like ours, and not only our community, in the African American community, in the minority communities across the city, a big burden. But I would say more than only the minority communities, African American and Latinos, but across the board for working people, is becoming tougher and tougher to make ends meet, even working 40 hours a week. We see small businesses struggling. We just saw the displacement of over 280,000 residents, mainly in the African American community, and they continue push for budgets that are balanced in the backs of the working people, the most vulnerable. And I think that what we saw from last night that I do think is very relevant for this conversation is that even though the fair tax did not win statewide, in Chicago, 71% of Chicagoans voted in favor of the fair tax. Despite the big money spending, we have billionaires like Ken Griffin spending $56 million to misinform the public about how we're going to tax the retirees' income and focus on seniors, especially in the Latino community. But at least here in Chicago, I think having grassroots efforts, being able to mobilize, organize locally, connect with different groups that are advocating for better policy. We cannot, in my opinion, continue to have a flat tax. We cannot continue to put all the burden on the most vulnerable and working people. So it's interesting to see that at least progressive politics, I think, in the Latino caucus seem to be changing for, I think, a demand for constituents to have more responsive, more responsible, and better representatives in general. And I do think the influence of progressive government and progressive platforms is growing, at least here in Chicago, but it's a lot of work to do. I think it's, of course, concerning that we still have some, the influence of big money. It still continues to be a huge issue, not only here, but across the country. I do think that it still has a big issue in our city, a big influence. And I think the goal is, I think that what we got from last night is that organizing works. We do have a strength within local communities, and all politics are local. And I do think that we can make significant gains on representatives that speak to the real issues of the ground, of the real issues of our constituents. And I see that was reflective, I think, our efforts for the fair tax. Unfortunately, of course, there's a lot of more work to be done. Cook County, I think, is still got a 52% on the fair tax, for what I can tell in the last numbers. But statewide, of course, we did not meet the threshold. Again, I do think that it speaks on some positives. I mean, in the national sphere, I saw, at least I personally, see young figures like Alejandra Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida, and I think Cory Bush and a few others, right? That I do think speak to a new wave of hopefully progressive leaders that hopefully hold the party accountable. I mean, to me, it says a lot that the election is this close, because I think as a country, I think as communities that we represent, I do think that we have better options, and that we should be offering better options to our constituents and our people across the country. I do think there's a lot of organizing to do. Obviously, the numbers, are very clear. That we have a very polarized country right now. We see that in our communities. I think you can make the case on the north side and the south side of the city as well. It's still polarizing views, but I do believe that arguments are made and democracy is made in these spaces with ideas, with proposals, and a track record that hopefully shows our constituents that there's a better way to do things. Like I said, I don't see the fair tax necessarily as all bad if you break it down, and I do think that you all do that well in breaking down and looking at the full picture and the whole story. I think that there's a lot to analyze nationally where we are in these historic moments, but I feel optimistic, at least in the numbers of the Latino community. It seems that of course there are still pending issues, immigration reform and others that I do think fell short in the platforms that we're offering to people. But I do think that there's a new wave, and I think a lot of the young Latinos that are coming in are more engaged. And I think in the 25th ward, if I can share this before maybe we can go to another question, but when I saw, in the 25th ward yesterday was give me hope. We saw, in every precinct, a very good vibe, good turnout. I think that we maybe, I haven't seen the whole numbers, but we may have done better than 2016. So we're increasing our voting turnout. I think in the polls we saw, given, of course, that many judges traditionally tend to be seniors, and of course they could not, and many opted out of being judges in this cycle. But it was good to see a lot of young people, a very diverse crowd of judges. That to me, that was different. and a really good vibe in the polls, with the experienced judges and new judges working together uh, with pride about the civic engagement efforts. I hope that more people continue to be engaged and see a bigger turnout, and people speaking about issues that in the past were not even discussed. Judges, the election of judges, outside, of course, of the presidential, the fair tax, and other issues that it gives me hope, but it also the challenge and the opportunity to have more conversations on the ground, to engage more meaningfully with the constituents, with voters about issues that affect them directly. I don't think that business as usual is going to survive in this climate where people want to be, and by need, of course, but the urgency, they want to be part of these conversations. And I think through this process, with more robust conversations, I do think that we will come with a more robust platforms that are beneficial to all of us.
I wonder, Alderman, if you could explain to the class and the alumni and the honor students who are here how you're doing these new things with IPO and how that works in the 25th ward, since it doesn't work in most wards in Chicago.
Thank you. That's a great question, Professor Simpson. It takes time. I first got, and just to give you a little bit of background, one of my mentors was Key Duffy. She used to be one of the advisors for the LGBTQ community during the Harold Washington years. And she was the first one who really walked me through the importance of an independent political organization. I think the IVI-IPO and other organizations have championed this with Leon Deprez and other aldermen that I do think that in the past have shown that perhaps independent political organizations in a nonpartisan race can be very effective. I obviously have my perspective, and I do think that through ideas and arguments, we can engage residents on an issue-driven platform. So an independent political organization here have a legacy. I had the honor to continue some of these efforts that are going back, at least here in the 25th ward and the 22nd ward, back to the 1980s, where there was, along with Harold Washington and many progressives, I think there was a wave for independent political organizations in the 22nd ward. Here in the 25th ward, had, of course, conversations with Congressman Garcia and former representative and former alderman Juan Solis, who, of course, gave us some of the historical knowledge that I do think is important of, the importance of these organizations and the challenges as well. So when I ran last cycle, 2015, against my predecessor, we run in this platform as an independent with the support of the independent political organization that we were trying to revive. Of course, as you would imagine, when you are running against the zoning chair, was my predecessor was the chair of the zoning committee, had a lot of influence within the party and within the Latino community. It wasn't an easy lift. But I tell you that I was so impressed by the response of the people on the doors, door to door, engaging in dialogue. Of course, I did have experience as a teacher working in the community and as a former director. And at that point, I was a board member of the Pilsen Alliance, which was a community group that was doing a lot of grassroots campaigns. But it was very clear that the political conversations were missing. I mean, we were talking about issues. We were talking about the fighting for the $15 an hour, affordable housing, environmental justice. We were fighting at the time, a metal shredder right after that was coming in the community after we have worked to close down the coal plants. So it was clear that we were making some gains, but for as long as we were under the mercy of entrenched local representative that may decide with the big interest, with the pollutants and the corporations and developers that we were opposing, we were falling short. So we revived the 25th Ward independent political organization during the last cycle. like I said, I was very active as an organizer and a teacher, but with the mentorship of Kit Duffy, which she has passed away since, a few years ago, but she was instrumental in showing how this movement helped fuel support for Howard Washington at the time when we had an entrenched party, and how that will be maybe a pathway that can be an alternative to a very entrenched democratic organization. We fall short of the 70 votes. We were 70 votes short of the runoff. But I always saw the power of the organizing on the ground that was outside of just the grassroots organizing. And I understand now there are organizations that do the C4 and other structures, but I do think they have their own challenges and their own issues. I do believe that for us, it was successful, and it was important that we separate, the grassroots organizing, which is great and important, from the political organization that can work in conjunction and in support, but they are different in spaces, and we don't want to also co-opt, or take away from those efforts. We want to add and of course support those efforts, but the political arena is another arena that we needed to challenge. So after that, we continued to build. I eventually became the director of that organization, so I had to step back from the IPO a little bit, and I became just a member. I was very active on the IPO originally. Eventually, when I ran again, I re-engaged. I left my post. I had to resign, at least a year in advance, to prepare for the run for alderman. But I tell you that the strength of our campaign was in the independent political organization that was also building outside of Pilsen, because of course I was, working very focused on the Pilsen community. But as we were doing campaigns and the IPO was reaching Chinatown, the West Loop, Abla homes, we were making inroads, creating contacts and relationships in neighborhoods that otherwise have been segregated by design. And I do think that that's part of some of the issues with the nonprofits or other structures, that you are sometimes constrained to your community or your mission. The IPO had a strength in building bridges between communities. I think that they saw us as partners. The history, I will never forget this story about someone I met in the African-American community, a senior, who had an issue with me because I was a democratic socialist. And he said, like, oh my God, I don't know if I'm ready for that. I'm an African-American voter that, remembers the times of the Cold War, and I don't want to live that again. And through the conversation, I explained my platform. He was, I think, a skeptical voter. And I think that little by little, as we started to know each other a little bit more, she actually shared with me that she was a volunteer at one point with the 22nd War IPO. And that was a great platform for us to find common ground, and also for us to respect different perspectives within the political arena. And to know that, of course, we have a platform that we all should be discussing and be part of. She was good friends with Rudy Lozano and other leaders. And one time, when I won the election, and a few days later, she called me, and I just wanted to share this with you because it shows that sometimes we're skeptical by nature in the voters, and especially in this climate. But she confided with me that that she has lost hope, since the IPOs have lost strength, after the 80s and after Howard Washington. And that, she did not think that some of her efforts had been successful in the past. And that's what she was skeptical. And that's what she did not want to share with me that originally, but that to see the revival on IPO gave her great strength and hope, and also to hold me accountable, not to impose my views, so that we should always be democratic in our views. And I think that is the strength as well of having spaces like that, and that that we have to be building bridges between communities. I think that was a great, and I tell you, I would say that we have now in her one of our most committed volunteers in the IPO. So just to tell you, some of the interesting things that. And I think, to me, I know I just met the other day the IVI IPO new director, and we hope to see if a new wave of independent political organizations may be a venue that others, of course, would think, and perhaps that reform within the parties is another way, right? But I do think that we're in a kind of climate where I think we should explore all of it and see what our people, where do they land, you know, where would will we get that that real movement that we need.
And Alderman, just before we open it up to questions, I wonder if you could comment on the current situation in the city, particularly related to the city budget with the sort of the $2 billion gap between last year or this year and next year, and the difficulty of moving forward with the progressive agenda just because of the money issues, and maybe some of the tensions between the Progressive Caucus and the mayor.
Thank you. No, that's a great question. Of course, there's no doubt that that we were facing an unprecedented fiscal crisis, a fiscal deficit. That's unquestionable. And I think that we have been in this situation before, and we continue to kick the can, as we say. Now it seems like there's no more there's no more space to kick the can, and we must face some difficult choices. I think that the Progressive Caucus, and as a member, I cannot speak on behalf of the whole caucus, but I can speak on you know, some of the conversations that we have had. I think that there was a good editorial letter that we sent to the Sun Times that I recommend read as far as like the priorities and the suggestions that we have as a Progressive Caucus. I'm proud to say that I was one of the writers of that letter, that to the sometimes that's one thing that I think academia does prepares as well, is to, you know, to fight with arguments and editorials, and I think there's a lot of merit to that, and I think it's important that we fight it with arguments as we fight it with door knocking and phone calls and all that. I think that some of the tension lies with who picks up the bill. And I think that when we see a loss of you know, population, right, that continues to haunt us, right, I do think that losing or tax base is the biggest threat when we don't find a good balance in who carries the burden of all that. I think I hear a lot that we should all tighten our belts and that we should all be part of the solution, but when it comes down to the big money makers, I don't really see that. I mean, we see billionaires like Ken Griffin, who spend millions of dollars to avoid paying their first share, but you know, I don't see why they cannot pay those $56 million in taxes that will go towards the greater good. I do think that we do have unfortunately inequity that has reached unsustainable levels. I think the inequality that we see in our city, what we see, the huge differences between what happens in Englewood and what's happening in Lincoln Park, right? I mean, we live, you know, the tale of two cities, and the poverty and unemployment and the suffering in a time like this. To me, to think, and of course, a historic property tax increase that we just saw a few years ago under Mayor Emanuel, you know, $558 million on property taxes, you know, and most recently there was a report by the Treasurer's Office as of last week, who have shown that in some communities, like the communities that I represent, Pilsen and Chinatown, we have seen property tax increases fivefolded. I mean, it just, and I think, you know, of course, we hear some analysis that says, well, you know, it's just with the raise of living, the cost of living, but when you compare other municipalities, you know, the over reliance on property taxes is it's not a normal or sustainable way for us to balance our budgets. So I think that there's a big disagreement there. I think there's a disagreement also in terms of finding progressive revenues. We heard the budget director speaking as TIF surplus as a progressive revenue source, and that was kind of it. Not so sure how to call that. You know, maybe what kind of measure. I understand that we will have to declare a surplus. But of course, it gives me great concern that we are not finding, and I think I was concerned that we did not have a clear agenda for Springfield. In light of, as we knew that the fair tax was going to be, a risk, right? I know that we had, some conversations about the real estate transaction tax that the mayor supported in the past to make sure that is in line with what the ability to pay for developers and big interest is truly is. And also vacancy tax. I think there was also conversation about a corporate head tax. I think that we see cities like Seattle, taxing corporations like Amazon. We have to see that the economy has changed drastically after the pandemic. We see small businesses who sell retail or whatever the small businesses might be, who have a comparative disadvantage with corporations like Amazon that produce everything. And if they're able to operate without, an adequate way of taxing their revenue, which is have reached record numbers, we continue to see small businesses closing and really without alternative or real relief. So we must be able to find a balance. So our ability to pay taxes is based also on those comparative advantages and disadvantages that the pandemic unfortunately has created as well. So those are some of the concerns and that the Progressive Caucus has put forward, that we must find a different way to balance the budget without putting all the burden on the working people. The other thing has to do with fines and fees, because I think sometimes, and I think this is not to, to go to in the weeds of things, but I think we all know that there's one thing, campaigning is sometimes and oftentimes different than governing, and we all have to face tough issues. But I do think that there are fundamental policies that we have to agree on. I think the idea of fines and fees as money generators or revenue generators, as opposed to safety prevention measures, right? I think that's something that Mayor Lightfoot campaigned for. I think that's something that we must take into consideration, that finding an Uber driver, or finding someone who is delivering goods, or for going 6 miles per hour over the speed limit, can have devastating effects in a worker. And we got to be mindful of those decisions, because our concern in general is that continue to lose population, to continue to displace largely African American and Latino families is something of great concern for the caucus. I think that we're proposing some alternatives. I think that also there was an idea circulating about vacancy taxes, in terms of trying to address the speculation. So there are ways for us to prevent more regressive taxation. And I think everything has to be at the table. When things are not at the table, and then we have a very limited set of options without a conversation or a top-down approach, I do think that we are failing to provide what's possible in a time where we must have collaboration between Springfield, between the city, and especially between the mayor's office and aldermen.
So we have a few minutes for questions. You can signal that you want to do a question by writing into the chat to everyone. You can signal by simply turning on your video and holding up your hand like this, or you can do so if you can find the raise your hand function, which I don't see under reactions. You can raise your hand electronically and we will see it. The first question, it says it's Maureen Hellwig, but it isn't. Yes, sir, your question. Yes.
It's me, Maureen.
Oh, it is Maureen. Okay, good. Good to see you, Maureen. Go ahead and ask your question.
This is a question that I have for the alderman, actually, as well as for you, Dick, is this issue of socialism. The alderman mentioned it as some people taking, if he was considered a democratic socialist, taking that as a negative thing. And we heard from the results in the election in Florida, how the Latino, particularly the Cuban Latino community there, reacts against socialism like it's an evil. And I've always felt, both as an academic and just in real life, that Americans totally do not understand socialism separate from communism. Do you, either of you, have a suggestion for how we clarify this? I mean, Social Security would be defined by some as socialism, and yet I doubt that they would want to give it up.
Maureen, if you can keep the question brief because we have little time, Alderman,
I'm done.
I'd like to answer.
Yes, of course. No, thank you. And that's a great question. And I tell you that I not only grapple with this question within the Latino community, but you can imagine, in Chinatown that I also represent, the concerns that they had, equating, of course, socialism with communism, right? Now, so I think that it's important that we discuss these issues as they are, right? Like you said, I think that I think President Trump was calling Vice President Biden a socialist, right? I do think that there's a lot of misinformation about what socialism is and the policies that represent. I think that, and I think in today's standards, I think Franklin D. Roosevelt probably will be considered a socialist. And I do think that we have to see, of course, in Latin America, there's a larger question, right? Of unfortunately U.S. intervention in democracies that we must take into consideration. I grew up in Ecuador where we've seen, unfortunately, U.S. intervention take a huge toll. We have a dollarized economy, right? Talking about almost these little colonies that are developed, across the world. And of course, that represents real challenges on the ground. I do think foreign intervention is, even with the greatest intentions, only has led to authoritarian regimes. And it has led to, unfortunately, this misconception in Latin America of socialism. However, what I will say is that what you saw in Bolivia most recently is very telling about the effectiveness of socialist policies. Policies that are in line of protecting the public good, protecting government, making government more effective and serving the people. I don't think that there's any research that suggests that making sure that the national reserves of a country, we make the same case for Chile, for instance, with copper, right? Or in Bolivia with the uranium, or in Ecuador for oil, that there must be, a role of government to make sure that we, especially when it's such inequality. I think in Latin America, what we've seen is, of course, the influence of corporations and foreign intervention that has created a lot of this dysfunction, right? And I think that there is a much needed conversation about these policies. I'm committed with, and that's what I like to put always, the word democratic socialist, because with arguments, we must show, or arguments or policies defeat a different idea with arguments and a track record, not with imposition, not with authoritarian tactics, but with ideas. And I think that in Bolivia, we've seen that in the recent election, that there are democratic processes, so that there is not like the good and evil that is like, these extremes, right? That, all socialism is bad. And then, we can see that also in Europe, right? That we have had many socialist governments that have performed well. So again, I think to me, the issue of U.S. intervention is at the core of a lot of the issues that we have to grapple. I do think that there's a case to be made for democratic processes. And I think socialist policies are definitely an option that has to be considered in the ballot, and that we have to win out of merit, democratic merits. And I think that is here and across the world. I do think that as long as we're having these conversations, and which I had with our constituents about, what are those policies are, right? That affordable housing, Social Security, Medicare, all these are socialist policies. And I do believe that we are discovering and evolving, and hopefully with democratic principles, because I think that, sometimes, it's easy, unfortunately with this, to point out finger at that, right? But let's see what is alternative, right? And if the alternative is authoritarian casino capitalism, right? We ought to see what is best for our communities, So again, I do think that there has to be a broad conversation. I think Latin America is a very complex environment right now, but those conversations are happening. I want to just provide the other side of it, right? And I think that's what we have some commitment, right? And I think at least here locally, we're able to have these conversations. And even in Chinatown, I do think that we made a good case that some of these policies work.
So if others of you would like to ask questions, please turn on your video or put a note in the chat and let us know that you want to ask the alderman a question. We'll have about 5 or at most 10 minutes more, and then we'll have a special session with just the Honors College students. Other questions for the alderman? It's unusually quiet for this group of.
We have a question from Taha Doa.
Okay.
Chat.
I was just, it's kind of a general question. I was just wondering if you could reiterate what IPOs specifically are and what they do exactly.
Yeah, so the political, that's a great question. So I can explain a little bit more, not so generally, but specifically, you know, that we have it's like a precinct organization, right? Like the Democratic Party or Republican Party, they operate here worldwide. That's what is, you know, the independent political organization. Is a worldwide organization in the 25th ward with precinct representation that of course has a platform that has a membership and of course organized electorally, during elections to represent. In this case, of course, now we have won an election, so you will make the case that, you know, we represent the 25th ward. That's the organization that supported me. I do work, I'm a committeeman, so I do work with the Democratic Party, right? So the independent political organization works independently of me. They do what precinct work. They work on platforms, referendums. They have worked, in campaigns citywide and also even local referendums. For instance, we put a few years ago a referendum on lifting the ban on rent control that received. We were the only precinct organization or the independent political organization that put us the worldwide with a informational campaign. We received worldwide the only worldwide referendum. There were several others, but the only one worldwide. There were others in other wards, like about 15 wards, but in several precincts, we received over 70% of the vote. That has served us, to highlight, a platform of housing and to make this an issue of affordability, right? So they're non-binding, but they do help inform. So I do think that there is a lot of merit in this. They also did a referendum on moratorium on charter schools, I believe, a few years ago. So I do think electorally, but also on referendums. But it's a precinct organization, that I think that works electorally. I hope that answers your question.
Appreciate it, sir.
We do need to end the broader session, which has had the Honors College and the alumni joining the Chicago's Future class and the Chicago's Future lecture series. I would ask the Honors College students to stay, and we're going to have a small private discussion with the alderman and the Honors College alum. Thank you all for being here, and I'll see you at the next event, which is with former Governor Pat Quinn next Monday at the other website, other Zoom site. Thank you very much, and as soon as we have just the Honors College people left, I will turn it over to the Dean of the Honors College.
Thank you, Professor Simpson. So Alderman, let me introduce you to the students in Dick Simpson's class who are also members of the Honors College. The Honors College is about 2,200 students. We are the most diverse honors population in the country, also one of the highest achieving student bodies in the country. We, among considering our diversity, we have the highest Pell ratio of any honors population. The majority of our students come from the region. Also, a very large number of our students are interested in the common good, giving back to their communities, public service, and all of us on the faculty and staff, and I'm speaking on behalf of both groups, we're tremendously proud of every one of our students in the Honors College, and it's my privilege to introduce you to them. Students, you were already in the first hour, so Alderman Sigcho Lopez does not need an additional introduction from me. But I can thank you for joining us for this discussion. Ordinarily, when we're on campus, we provide lunch. We can't provide lunch at this point, but it's just really wonderful to be able to bring you together. And I will turn this over to you and our students. Sir, please.
And I think it would be useful if as many students as possible could turn on their video so the alderman could see you. And Alderman, I think we can do this pretty informally and maybe simply carry on a conversation. I know a number of the students are particularly interested in your success because, like you, they're UIC students and you've gone on to be alderman, and they're hoping to do similar things with their career, maybe not in the political arena.
Well, that's great. And I'm really grateful for the invitation, obviously, to meet with fellow UIC alumni and of course, the honors students. Gives me always great pleasure. And of course, we'll love to, welcome, of course, any of you to ask, of course, any direct questions, but also, we love to, offer an opportunity for anybody interested on, being part of an internship or anything that you are interested in to continue learning more. As a UIC alumni, I do think that I've seen the value of public education of an institution like UIC to provide this kind of connection, right, with neighboring communities like Pilsen, Chinatown, where, so close and sometimes it feels so distant. As like I said, as an alumni, I have the privilege to represent this community that is, I think, to me, a wonderful, beautiful community from Abla, Barbara Jean Wright, communities that are nearby campus that I, as a student, I used to walk around, never, had that, that knowledge of, what was going on in each community, what's going on in the lives of our neighbors, how is it, how government affects their lives, how, our decisions impact, the lives of families and students, seniors and veterans and so forth. So it's a great pleasure, to share with you, anything I can share that maybe can help inform your decisions, your career. We do hope to have more public servants. I hope certainly that we can have more people from UIC, and if anything that I can do to help out, thank you. Love to collaborate. So
Maybe some of you in the college would like to carry on the conversation with the alderman and maybe tell them a little bit about yourself and your interests, and we can move forward. Just turn on your video and unmute yourself.
I'll do some talking if that's all right. So I'm studying political science and philosophy. I'm a sophomore. I have a question regarding the fair tax amendment that was just rejected. To you, what are the next steps following this rejection? And what are the next steps in like formal routes, legislation, and what are the next steps in informal routes, community organizing and more ground up approaches?
Yes. So one second. Sorry, actually, I'm muted because it was a hearing. But definitely, I think that one of the things that in terms of, I think the question, if I didn't understand correctly, is in terms of the next step after the fair tax. Is that right? So well, I think we have to continue to build. I think that there is a great opportunity in the community to see this is not always about winning and losing. You can lose and you can win. You can win because you build. That's, I think, the fascinating part of politics. That sometimes you think that you win. You can win a campaign, you can win an issue in the short run, but in the long run, there may be consequences, right? That can create a larger loss. I do think in this case, and not to be overly optimistic, I do think the fact that we have 71% of the vote shows that we have an electorate that is informed, that we're able to start connecting with them, that we're not misled. Despite the big money that was spent in this election. I mean, there were millions of dollars that billionaires spent to misinform the public. So in this occasion, I do think that we do believe that 71% is something that we can build upon. We had conversations with people that were identified as supporters of fair tax, that believe in progressive revenue options, that believe in progressive government, perhaps. So I do think that it is important that we continue having those conversations on the ground, that we continue to engage with them, so that we can point out, because as you will see, austerity measures will create a lot of suffering in our communities. Bad decisions will have implications. And it's important that people understand that there are ways for us to address that we should not have these limited options, that this doomsday is inevitable, right? So that they don't fall into these traps of and I'm sure Republicans will be very happy to point out at the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party will point out Republicans, but I do think it's important to look at the issues, right? The issues that continue to be pushed aside. So I think this is a good opportunity for us to continue to build on the ground on the budget. I mean, that's a great opportunity for us to say, well, if fair tax didn't pass, what other progressive revenue options can we push for? Can we push for the corporate head tax, for instance? Can we push for the real estate transaction tax or the vacancy tax? Or, what are the options so that we can avoid more property tax increases, so that we can avoid taxing the working people? So I do think that can help us build to make the case, right? Because I'm sure there's going to be disappointment among people that, well, yet again, we are going to be picking up the bill. So it's important that we continue engaging, that we continue organizing. I tell you that for me, I remember clearly when, I lost my, when I ran the first time I lost, I was 70 votes short. And of course, there's a lot of people on the room who felt disheartened because you put a lot of energy, a lot of effort, you put your heart on, it was so close. But I tell you that to me, the results were, I was just so happy that we did so well, in my opinion. So it just motivated us to continue organizing, to continue say, well, we get close. Maybe we didn't get there, but what other things continue to build to hopefully one day get us there in a more comprehensive approach and reform across the government.
Other comments and questions?
Alderman, what words would you have to encourage people who are feeling dispirited, discouraged as a result of yesterday's election? I'm certainly seeing in my own timeline and my own news feed a great deal of discouragement, and even without the election yet being decided, people are depressed by the narrowness of this election. What words would you have for them?
Well, it's certainly, of course, concerning, right? When you see a very polarized, it's 50-50, right? At least from the people who came out and voted. I do think that there's a lot of reflection to do, indeed. I mean, we cannot ignore that elections have consequences, and policies during the last 4 years have had consequences in the lives of many, too many, who have passed away, and oftentimes situations that could have been handled more professionally. That the whole pandemic, we have over 200,000 people who have died in a situation where I think we can have prevented the loss of lives and across the country and here in the city as well. The immigration, of course, police brutality. There's a lot of reckoning to do, in terms of the racial disparities, the racism within our institutions, and a corporate agenda, right, that has continued to grow the inequalities and justifying them by dehumanizing those who think or look differently. Certainly, I think I just want to take a few minutes just to acknowledge that, because I do not want to make it look like I'm ignoring the suffering and the real pain on especially the most vulnerable immigrant communities, and I think especially Black youth right now, heavily impacted by the unfortunate situation of our public institutions. What I like to say, in the reflection the little reflection I've been able to, because I think we're all processing this, is that we have seen, of course, the suffering, unfortunately the options that were given to us, but that we should not for a second believe that there are not people out there, right, who did not participate. So how do we got to make sure that people participate? When people believe that their vote doesn't matter, we do have a problem. When we see people who have been denied the right to vote, we got to see that in many states, we still have prohibited, inmates, for instance, to the right to vote. I do think that there's a lot of reform, a lot of work that needs to be done, and that we need people who care. If in this moment in time you find yourself depressed, upset, concerned, anxious, you care. And we have to start there. We do care about others. We care about one another. And of course, the political arena has been designed to keep us away from participating, to make it difficult, complicated, unappealing. We do need more participation. I do think there's no doubt about it. We still see, even though voting turnout improved, is not quite in the levels that we must have turnout, so that we do not have to have those choices in front of us. I do think that other choices exist. I tell you that that's one of the reasons what motivated me for run for office, because I knew in a community like Pilsen or Chinatown or Habla, there are unique communities in the city. There's not another community like this. We cannot replicate it. We cannot cookie cutter. We cannot standardize it and sell it to another, to put it elsewhere. Communities that have welcomed immigrants like myself, who have made us feel human, accepted, embraced, not many. Same in Chinatown. In Habla, we have one of those few strong enclaves of the African-American community that have been there for generations, but yet, of course, battling disinvestment, even though we're so close to resources. So to me, the possibilities are there, right? So that the possibility of what's possible has to overcome the fear, the frustration, the anger, so that we can build the communities that we want to see. I think my message will be that nobody's going to build it for us. That to me became very clear when I first got involved about 10 years ago in organizing, and when I was teaching. So this is not new. I mean, what we see right now is not new. I think we're reckoning with the explicit language that unfortunately is used, and the explicit policies that are unfortunately implemented. But this is unfortunately not new. It's not new in our country. It's not new in our city. And nobody's going to build it for us. We have to build an alternative ourselves. So getting involved, getting engaged, and not getting overwhelmed. All politics are local. I mean, we got to think globally, but act locally. The difference that we can make in our neighborhood, in our block, in our city, in our communities is great. We are in need for more, leaders, real leaders in our community. And I tell you, it's possible. It's possible if we overcome the fear that is real, because fear is real. And the big influence of money, there's challenges ahead. But this is a moment of reflection, but I think is a call for action, that we must take action and organize. I think that's what I say, organize electorally, outside the electoral arena, and organize in every, organize within the university, organize in all our spaces to improve our public institutions, to improve our neighborhoods, and, hopefully have a government one day that reflects our values and principles. And I do think that we were close this time. We were very close, but, we got to keep on fighting.
Thank you. Yolanda, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I thought about it, but then I talk a lot, so I thought maybe you're right.
No, please.
Hola, Byron. Un placer.
Hola, Yolanda. Gusto verte.
Igualmente. So I think for me, one of the questions that came up, and you have alluded to this earlier, so I don't feel free to not spend a lot of time on this if you've kind of covered some of it. But I was just thinking, like, how do we bridge our communities? How do we find common ground? Specifically for you, I was thinking like Chinatown versus Pilsen. And so more recently, just kind of hearing the Latino issues versus like the Black Lives Matter, and kind of saying, well, if they don't support us, why do we support them? Which has been disheartening for me to kind of hear some people think of things this way. So that's one of my questions. And then my second question is, if we find common ground, once we find common ground, how do we move from that into action items? I was thinking, especially for the students that probably have a lot more energy than I do and can engage in some of these things on campus.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think is, and of course it's not easy to have these conversations, right? The difficulties of having these uncomfortable conversations are very real, right? And I think that many restorative justice approaches, and I do think it's important because, like I said, overcoming the fear is very difficult. Accepting, biases is not easy, accepting those notions that we have grew up with and become vulnerable is not easy, especially in larger settings. I think that that's the thing, the power of organizing. I do think that sometimes having these conversations, take time for people to open up, to people to become vulnerable, to be trusting, because these are times that not only have polarized us, but has created fear, anxiety, distrust. So having these conversations take time, and I mean, it's not easy. And I do think that it's important to look into practices of having these tough conversations, especially if it's in a class setting, right? I tell you here, what we've done is, and I believe sometimes, actions speak louder than words, right? We have talked about, communities being always pitched against each other. Oh, Chinatown has a library. We never got this. oh, they got this, but you see, that's the problem with austerity, right? That it creates limited scenarios where we don't discuss, well, why don't we both have good libraries? Why don't we both have good public schools? Why don't we both have access to affordable housing and good public and good paying jobs? I think that's the challenge, that we have to create something outside that binary, unfortunately, and, yes, I mean, we got to reckoning that, we do have, racism in our communities, and we got to reckon with that, and that we have to be, responsible, for what's happening around us. That doesn't mean that we cannot change or we cannot be part of the solution, but dismissing an issue will not get in, ignoring a problem will never get us closer to a problem. I tell you, in Chinatown, there will be some, there were some really tough conversations about racism towards African Americans. There was a whole organization that was created out of that. Young people, there was an African American young woman and Asian American woman that got together and said, this is a real big issue. It's much larger than just having a few conversations on the side. We have systemic issues that are created because, of course, as you come to a different country and a different reality, and then you are fed information that unfortunately comes from a media that profits from, selling newspapers or selling news, not by educating and creating better information to address our issues. So we cannot rely on media to think that having more responsible public media will be a tremendous help, to talk about poverty, to talk about the issues that we have in common, but that will be inconvenient to the status quo. So in that sense, we are left with a very, very, that's what I said, the importance of getting involved. We have to take action. We have to go. And again, I'm very proud of, I think that the organization is called People Matter. If you ever want to check it out, I think is an interesting approach. They have had town halls, they have worked with public officials to address systemic racism, against African Americans in Chinatown. And it's an interesting approach. And I think that they are dealing on how we can be in solidarity. And as a result, that they coordinated the first time I've seen a march in support of the Black Lives Matter movement a few months ago, where the Asian American community became more vocal, and they were expressing, through leadership, some of the misconceptions and myths and misinformation, to challenge that and to challenge each other, to be, to see the humanity in one another and where the racism is coming from and where and what our true values are. So I'll tell you that is a process. Like I said, I don't know if we ever have had, a way to address that, because it's systemic, it's educational, it's in our public institutions too. We have to make sure that, and it's not only with curriculum, it comes with investment, making sure our kids are treated no matter, no matter what the zip code is, to make sure that they learn about their history, their culture, that they feel proud of who they are, so that they, insecurity is, and the shame that a lot of our kids grow up with because of institutional racism, and white supremacy that unfortunately is very real and unfortunately legitimized by the White House. So we got to be, in these times, I think, and especially in educational institutions, we have a big responsibility, and to learn how to do this.
Thank you.
Well, sir, if there aren't any more questions, what would you want students who are interested in lives of public service or civic engagement, what would you want to tell them without them?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Rob. Yeah, no, definitely, of course, an open invitation, of course, to be part of the change that they want to see in the community. To Yolanda's point, with actions speak louder than words, having leaders who build bridges. We're very intentional about, bringing the Latino community with the Chinese community, with the African American community. We have stakeholders meetings, we have town homes, we get out there for, to volunteer drives. There's an opportunity, a great opportunities to help in our office. So of course, the open invitation to be part of the change that you all want to see, as an intern or in whatever capacity, volunteer in our office, seeking those opportunities, getting informed, getting a feet on the ground. I think is a great opportunity. And of course, in your own institution in UIC, getting involved in organizations in these kind of spaces, I do think is a great way to make a difference.
Thank you, Alderman. And you've been very generous with your time on a day that is probably very busy for everybody who is in elective politics. We have thank you for your for the email address also. Invite students to contact the alderman. Again, thank you for your time. Students and staff, thank you so much for showing up. Enjoy the weather, and thank you for your service. Thank you for your dedication to our city and the people in it. It's important to have people like you who care. So,
thank you so much, Ralph, and everybody for the invitation. Look forward. Good to see you, Yolanda, and everybody else. It's great to see some good friends. And Ralph, thank you again. And anytime, please keep in touch. And I look forward to seeing you soon. And enjoy the day. And let's keep on fighting.
okay. Thank you.
Thank you.